Rikers Island is basically directly under the flight path of planes traveling to and from LaGuardia Airport, and curiously, its development was somewhat in parallel with the onset of commercial aviation, meaning it saw some nearby crashes, one of which came down on the compound's land. On February the 1st, 1957, Northeast Airlines Flight 823 crashed onto Rikers Island shortly after departing LaGuardia, killing 20 and injuring 78 out of the 95 passengers and 6 crew. The pilot manning the flight went on to have something of a career in crashing, as he survived 3 plane crashes in 5 years. Captain Marsh of Miami first crashed on January the 14th, 1952 in the East River, 300 yards from Rikers Island. The plane was only in 9 feet of water, so the captain managed to smash the window and escape. Everyone survived, with only 6 requiring time in the hospital. Then again, in 1953, his landing gear collapsed, and the right wing of the airplane was torn off at LaGuardia. The subsequent crash in 1957 was actually the only one to see casualties. Astonishingly, when the crash occurred, inmates immediately ran to the wreckage, undoubtedly saving many lives. As a result of their selfless actions, 30 of the 57 inmates who assisted with the rescue effort were released immediately, with 16 receiving a sentence reduction by 6 months. This event stands out, but there were other exceptional circumstances in which prisoners left early. For example, during the AIDS crisis in the 1980s and 90s, the prison sometimes granted early release to terminal HIV-positive inmates so they could die peacefully in their homes. But more on that later. By the 1970s, conditions began degrading to unprecedented levels. Blocks designed for 240 inmates were now housing over 330. Corruption and neglect were the norm, and it became apparent to everyone that this arrangement was not sustainable. These issues were not new. From the onset of the jail complex, smuggling by the guards was commonplace. Old newspaper reports from the 1920s recall guards being prosecuted for those crimes and more, but in the 1970s, another eternal aspect of the island would show its face: riots. In 1975, the complex was overrun by 1,200 inmates, taking 5 guards hostage. They demanded improved conditions at the overcrowded and isolated jail in the East River, and surprisingly, the authorities met these demands, and the guards were released. Now, not to take the side of the criminals here, but they may have had a point. You see, Manhattan had closed significant portions of its notorious Tombs jail, with Rikers Island taking on the spillover. The ramifications were endless here. Prisoners were routinely, illegally denied visitation, recreation, and so on. Or perhaps it's best put in the words of Judge Morris Lasker, who described it as, quote, the most serious and potentially explosive prison atmosphere to exist in New York City. Anyhow, the release of the guards and meeting the conditions of the hostage takers set a very dangerous precedent. Hence, 200 of the prison staff began shouting, "Strike!" and left the job. A gesture that brought no actual ramifications, as nearly all those same guards returned to work in the following days. As for the prisoners and their complaints about overpopulation, that wouldn't improve either. In fact, conditions were about to get much worse. The 1980s would see the population triple from about 5,000 inmates to 15,000, and with that rise, saw a slew of illnesses such as AIDS, tuberculosis, syphilis, drug addiction, and so on. The medical readiness for so much disease was utterly ineffective, with nearly 20% of the population testing positive for tuberculosis alone. I need to point out an essential factor here. Of the 15,000 inmates at any given time, 70% were awaiting trial or pre-trial release, meaning that not only were they considered legally innocent, but that incarceration was typically brief. They would soon have access to the outside world, contact with a greater population. Hence, the cesspool they were living in was beginning to affect people outside of the jail. According to the Daily News, one person with tuberculosis returning to a homeless shelter, for example, on average, infected up to 50 other people. As a result of the public outcry, solutions were sought to deal with the overcrowding. And in 1992, the now famous 800-bed barge was installed nearby on the East River to accommodate the extra inmates, perhaps in keeping with the maritime theme of the landscape in general. As it became known, the boat was initially used by New York City's Department of Juvenile Justice and received many alterations over the years. Although the inmates outright hated the solution, it was a cheap and immediate solution for the city. They expanded on this type of jailboat housing by reconstructing 2 British military transport barges from the Falkland Wars and 2 1950s-era Staten Island ferry boats, accommodating another 162 inmates each. The ferries were eventually sold for salvage around 2003, however, the boat remains. Best efforts aside, the boat solved very little. In 1995, the overpopulation of the jail began menacing nearby communities, who proclaimed their concern about the environmental impacts of the traffic moving to and from Rikers Island, not to mention all the traffic accessing the nearby airport. Robert Moses probably rolled in his grave. You see, the massive regional highway network cut right through the area to cap it all off. The then Queensboro president, Claire Schumann, proposed converting the area into a recreation space, arguing that the jail was unsustainable, proclaiming, quote, "The way things are now, people going to Rikers Island don't have a place to go to the bathroom, a place to eat, or a place to get changed for the bus." Rikers Island is connected to the community via a bridge, and it's very close to the airport as well. According to Newsday, you could almost walk from Rikers to the airport during low tide. The bridge was opened on November the 22nd, 1966 at the price of $10 million, and before that time, it was only accessible via boat. The City of New York operated the ferry service and provided transportation for prisoners, staff, and visitors, but once the service concluded, the docks were effectively abandoned. The ferry port remains to modern day, though they are rusty and gradually falling apart. Running a prison center on an island presents some logistical challenges. So back in 1985, there was a proposal to ferry prisoners and visitors via boat directly from Manhattan, but the idea proved to be too impractical. Anyhow, once on the complex, there are 10 different facilities with various purposes, from detention for adult males, housing sentenced adolescents, and segregated areas for teens. The Rose M. Singer Center houses adolescents and female adults, with the North Infirmary for general medical needs and the West facility accommodating inmates with contagious diseases. Some have called this the world's largest penal colony, and in light of its size, it also requires schools, clinics, chapels, sports fields, gyms, grocery stores, various shops, a power plant, and a bus depot. And according to UnitedStates.org, an institute on the island also specialized in housing homosexuals, bisexuals, and transgender inmates. However, that was until 2005, when it was closed for security purposes, which has been a very problematic issue in general. A report by NBC News described Rikers Island as, quote, hell plain and simple, with former inmates alleging that prisoners, or technically the accused, ran the facility, and a former warden proclaiming that there was a shank under every pillow. Recently, some inmates have been released because the jail itself was too dangerous. The danger affects everyone inside, from the medical staff to the officers and the prisoners. Currently, the facility has experienced a staffing crisis, with nearly 1/3 of correctional officers not showing up to work at a given time, meaning intervention of violence is limited and searches don't happen. But with thousands of officer assaults happening yearly, who could really blame them? Until next time, this is Ryan Socash, signing off.